Well, hello. Thank you for joining us here via Zoom and Facebook Live, both at the same time. This is the Vision for Future Ministry workshop here for, and I am Pastor Josh, the new pastor here at your church. Some of you have met me, some of you have spoken with me, some of you haven't. But this is a great opportunity for us to hang out as virtually as we can and to learn a little bit more about what's going on at the church and what's going to be coming up. And, this is kind of a process for discerning, figuring out what God is calling us to do here. So we're going to look at that from a couple different perspectives. But first, let's go ahead and get the presentation running. And if there's anybody coming in late, you can definitely just pop on in whenever you're ready. And we'll get you caught up as best we can. But we're going to go ahead and get started. So I'm just going to hope the technology works here. Looks pretty good to me. So, like I said, that's me there. That's Josh Pontius, and I am the redevelopment pastor here at your church. So let's go ahead and get started now. So here we are. Here is our kind of outline for how this is going to go. First, we're just going to talk about who I am and why we're here. There's going to be multiple little units of presentation throughout the morning. And then after we've done I've done a little bit of talking. I'm going to send you all into breakout groups so you can be in small groups of about five, where you can have discussion about what we just talked about. There's going to be questions on the screen, and it should be pretty straightforward what you should do. Don't feel the need to say anything you don't want to say. Feel free to be totally open about what your thoughts and opinions are on whatever it is we're talking about right now. um we're not going to call on everybody for answers. I just want you to have these small group discussions, and then we'll come back and just anybody who feels like sharing from a group can give a little insight. The point is not to come up with a consensus or this is what we all think. I really want this to be an opportunity for everybody to speak their mind and let us know what's going through your head as we go through these topics. So we're gonna do that a couple times. We're gonna take a couple breaks. It's gonna be a long morning. So don't feel, like obligated to stay the whole time, but I'll try to give you enough breaks for coffee and to use the facilities as we need to. So let's move through this. So like I said, here's a term. So like I said, here's a time for a welcome and introduction. And the first thing that I want to talk about is this. As we're just starting to look at what church is going to be like after this pandemic, after this quarantine, after this whole COVID-19 thing is over, what is church supposed to be like now? Um, we've been through some difficult times, and I know that you, as a congregation, have been through some really, really tough stuff, and we've had to change how we do everything. That's the reason why we're still having this meeting digitally. I know some people have started to get vaccines, not everybody has. We didn't think it was a good idea to try to do a little bit of both, so we're doing this all online. But the question starts to be asked over the last few months is, when we get back to doing worship and ministry in person, what is that supposed to look like? Is the goal to just, okay, quarantine is over and let's just go back to doing whatever it is we were doing before? And if you haven't noticed already, I'm not a very traditional guy. I don't do things in kind of traditional, old-fashioned kind of formats. I tend to push the boundaries. I like to do new things, and that's one of the reasons why I've been called here as a redevelopment pastor. Um, the congregation, the council, the call committee got together and said, "Okay, we're looking for somebody to do some new things here." Now, I'll admit, I'm sure there are some of you that didn't necessarily agree with that assumption that, hey, I kind of liked what we were doing. I enjoyed how we did church, how we do ministry around here. We don't need to change. And I respect that. And that'll be part of today's listening and visioning, to hear from you, to hear what it is you have to say and what it is you care about. And what are those things that you did before that maybe should be carried forward or that we can learn from and we can grow on. That's all a part of this. So we don't want to exclude you from the conversation. But the truth is during our study, during this time of quarantine, of pandemic, before I came here, I spent a lot of time and research looking at, what is supposed to be next. Is the post-pandemic time supposed to be just like the pre-pandemic time? So one of the things that I started to do while I was still finishing up in seminary is decide to read extra books and do extra study on this. One of the things that I did pick up is this book by Tom Rainier, "The Post Quarantine Church," and some of the ideas are going to be coming from that. The general assumption that maybe now is the time instead of just going back to the way things used to be, because the way things used to be didn't work for everybody. I could talk here for hours and throw all sorts of data and statistics at you about church attendance and church engagement and how excited people were to come to church and how often. You've heard that all before. This is not why we're here. We're under the assumption that maybe now's a good time to try something new. We've already not been doing what we used to do. So maybe this is time just to continue that. We're going to kind of work under that basic assumption, knowing that there's still going to be some great things from our past that we're going to be carrying forward. Now, with all of that being said, I want us to look at something very important that some of you may not have looked at in a very, very long time. Now, some of you may not have looked at this in a long, long time. Some of you may be just fresh out of confirmation or teaching a confirmation class, or maybe you just really like hanging out and reading your small catechism all the time. I know I keep mine with me at all times. I'd show you the app on my phone that does the same thing, but my phone is being used to broadcast this right now, so I'm obviously not going to show you there. Um, but this is Luther's explanation to the eighth commandment. And I want us all to hold it in mind as we proceed through the rest of the day. Because, like I said before, some of us are really anxious and excited to try new things and to just throw out everything and start fresh. And some of us are a little bit more hesitant, a little bit more reserved, a little more comfortable with the way things were. So I'm going to read this, and I encourage you to read it here on the screen with me. And it is the commandment about not bearing false witness. It says, "You shall not bear false witness against your neighbor." And Luther's explanation to what is this, or what does this mean, is this: it means we are to fear and love God, so that we do not tell lies about our neighbors, betray or slander them, or destroy their reputations. And here's the important part: instead, we are to come to their defense, speak well of them, and interpret everything they do in the best possible light. That last part is really key for our discussions today. So, no matter where you are on the spectrum of let's keep things the same and let's do all new things and throw out everything, let's try to remember that each and every one of us is a part of this, is a part of the church, and is a beloved part of God's creation. Um, our job is not to try to convince everybody or to decide that they're wrong and I'm right, or vice versa. Probably not, but maybe. The goal is not to put anybody down or degrade them or make them feel bad about why they feel the way they do, but to interpret everything they do and say in the best possible light. And I think if we use that as our kind of core mantra, if we all say, I am going to listen and speak about everything in the best possible way, then I think we're going to have a really productive and great time here this morning. So, with that being said, let's take a look at the next section. Just kidding. What I meant to say is we're going to have our first breakout session right now. So I'm going to get you all situated into your individual breakout groups. And here's what I want you to do. I want you to introduce yourself to your breakout group. Even if you think they all know you, I want you to take these steps because you never know. You don't want to assume. First is your name and the number of years that you've been a part of this faith community, a part of this church. And then the main question for discussion I want you to bring up, the main thing I want you to describe to the group is, what's your favorite non-church activity or hobby? And I know we get a little lost on this because it's been so long since we've been able to do some of these things. But try to remember back that far, back to the before times. What's your favorite non church thing to do? I'm going to set you up in those breakout groups, and I'll see you in about 10-15 minutes. And I'll send you a notification to tell you to come back to the main group. I'll see you in a few minutes. Okay, we're all back? Okay, I think we're all back. Great. So now that we're all back and filtering back in, I want to get into our first kind of presentation unit. And that is what part of the Bible that we're going to be using to kind of frame our discussion. Because I think as Christians and as a church, the first thing we should be doing is, well, what's in the Bible? What's in our scriptures? Where's our example from? So we're going to go ahead. I'm going to switch over to the presentation view in just a second. And one of the things we're going to do is we're going to look at the Bible and see, what did the early church look like and do, and how did they interact? How did they make decisions? How did they deal with each other? And how did they deal with what was going on in their lives? So, of course, we're going to be looking at well, wait, early church in the Bible, Paul's letter to the Romans. I'm sure a lot of you who've ever thought like, oh, if we're going to look at the early church, we're going to look at the book of Acts, right? That's the quintessential book of, here's how the early church did things. Every seminar I ever went to said, "I gotta look at Acts. You want to be like the early church? Let's look at Acts. Let's make sure Acts. Let's follow the disciples. Let's follow the apostles. Let's see how the church got started in Jerusalem." And as I was in seminary and as I was studying these things, as I was looking at the early church and how they handled themselves, their day-to-day kind of stuff, Romans makes a lot more sense than Acts does. Acts is a book that's filled with descriptions of leaders and quarrels, and I've got this whole book introducing the New Testament that really lets us know that Acts is primarily, especially that first half, it's about the apostles, it's about the people closest to Jesus and how they set up church functions and how they baptized people, and all that's really great. But for me, when I studied Romans, when I did a deep dive on Romans, I got a much better sense of how a church that is not quite sure how to proceed forward should handle things. So, one of the primary books I did this, I did a course specifically on Romans, and no, the course wasn't on how is Romans the model for modern church. But as I was reading and studying Romans, I just kept getting this feeling like there's something to this, because churches, unfortunately, because they're filled with regular people like you and me, uh, have issues. There's conflict. How do you deal with it? How do you handle differences of opinion? How do you navigate change? How do you navigate what's going to come next? How do we navigate how we do things day to day? And as I was reading this great book and studying it, the story of Romans, I just saw this church in Rome that Paul was writing to, and he was laying out these great explanation and understanding of how they should be church together, how they should approach decisions, how they should approach how they did things. And it was so much more powerful to me than the classic example of Acts. So I know what some of you might be thinking right now. Wait a minute, Romans. I know Romans. We hear it from the lectionary even once in a while. We've heard it preached, and I've heard it like, it's, well, isn't that just like all the do's and don'ts, and here's the rules, and here's how you understand God, and how does that help us understand community? There's been a lot of research into this. First, Martin Luther, the guy who started the whole Lutheranism thing, even though he really asked for it not to be named after him. Sorry, y'all. It's in his writings. He didn't want it. But beyond that, Martin Luther wrote a commentary on Romans, and Philip Melanchthon, who was one of his assistants in getting all of our founding kind of documents together, they were really sure that Romans was Paul writing his perfect explanation of what the gospel is, who God is, who Jesus is. There's not a greater story to it. Yeah, there's some bits in it about he gives a little bit of advice. Yeah, okay, there's, hey, can I get some money to go to Spain? But traditionally that's been a really easy way to look at it. Um it's not a bad way to look at it. So we had this whole, what did Luther think? And then we did years of study of like, okay, well, let's assume Luther is right about this, and not just Lutherans. Catholics have even gone back and looked at Romans through this lens. The Episcopalians, the Presbyterians, the Baptists, they've all gone, okay, let's just assume Romans is just this big book of here's here's what I think about God, and that's the important thing. A couple years ago, there was this push to try to pretend that Luther never wrote anything about Romans. It didn't have an opinion, or who cares what Luther thinks? It only matters what we think now. It only matters what matters to us. And the 500 and some years of theological work between then and now is useless. Let's just toss it all out because it's doing too much to color our interpretation, to change our minds about it. Well, recently there's been this push to do a little bit of both. First up is, why was Romans written the way it was written, to who it was written, to the people in Rome? Second is, how has 500 years of theological tradition of Lutherans and Protestants looking at Romans, how does that shape our ideas about God? And how has that evolution mattered? And third, what does Romans mean to us? Because if it doesn't mean anything to us, if we can't articulate what it means to us without looking at those two other pieces, then what are we doing with it? There's got to be more. So it's this great idea of really doing a little bit of everything to really try to get at what Romans is all about. What is God trying to say through Paul for us to understand? And is that the same thing that it needed to be for Martin Luther, or for the same thing of the people of Rome? We don't know. But we have to go a little bit beyond Luther without completely ignoring him. And so that's kind of a little bit of a framework for some of the ideas that we're going to look at while we go through Romans. Don't assume it's just a letter to some people in Rome. Don't assume it's Martin Luther's perfect explanation, that all of his little explanations in his commentaries and that you may have heard in sermons about it are just like, that's what you need to know. Don't worry about anything else. It doesn't really matter to you today. It's just, this is what you have to believe. And also, don't just think it was written just for you. Understand that this text has been used and sometimes misused over the years, and to understand where those people came from, where they got those ideas. The long story short is, try to keep an open mind. Listen, really listen, both with your ears and with your heart, to see what is Romans saying to us that we can learn about how to be church today. Now, with this section, we're not going to do a breakout group because there's not much I think that you would have a lot of questions with. If you have any, I'll listen to them right now. So if anybody has just a desperately in-breaking question in their head, I'd be happy to hear it. All right. Well, thank you for your questions. I hope I was able to answer them well enough. No promises. If you still have questions about this section, you can save them for the end, or you can just shoot me an email, a text message if you want to talk. I'd be happy to do that. So we're going to move on to our next section, the basics of mission and evangelism. Now, to say that I have a big focus on mission, evangelism, outreach, reaching new people that aren't connected with the church regularly, or never have been, or maybe used to be and aren't anymore, is an understatement. It's a big thing of mine. It's why I got into mission development and redevelopment, trying these new things. So to say I have a few books on the matter. like, we're not even scratching the surface here. Between the books and the articles, it's the podcasts. Heck, my Instagram feed tells me things about mission and evangelism. Um, it's all kind of an understatement if I say that this is kind of my thing. But it may not be super familiar to you. So I guess in this section we're going to take a step back from Romans itself and look at what it is I'm talking about. What it is that we're trying to accomplish as a congregation, as a church, moving forward, so that we can go back and reframe it through this lens of Paul's letter to the Romans. One of my favorite church communicators, Brady Shearer, he's got this little tagline that keeps reminding me that that churches and their missions and their vision statements and all of their things that they should kind of put out there as their primary, like, this is what we're about, um, it should be really simple. It should be a combination of the Great Commandment and the Great Commission, the greatest commandment and the Great Commission. Love God, love neighbor, make disciples. That's it. That is what churches are supposed to be about. Because if you're doing those three things and you're really taking them to heart, moving through them and framing everything you do and say as a congregation and as a follower of Christ, you're going to be in good shape. You're probably doing kind of the things that we should be doing as church. Love God, love neighbor, make disciples. Sometimes it's more complicated than that. You got to get into the details. But if you just frame your questions, frame your decisions around those things, you'll be in great shape. Love God, love neighbor, make disciples. So, I told you I'm here to do what's called mission redevelopment. Um, what is that? What is it we're trying to do here? What is it we're trying to get a vision for? Because I can come in and tell you, here's all the things that we need to do. Here's the kind of music we should have. Here's the kind of children's programs we should have. Here's the way the building should look. Here's how, what instruments there should be. What should the choir do? What should the a band leader do? What is the Instagram and the Facebook going to look like? I gotta tell you, I'm not here to tell you how to do all of church. I have ideas, I have a lot of training, but I need to hear from you. I need to understand what it is that matters to you. But the main purpose is to not throw out the baby with the bathwater, but to try to strip away the non essential stuff that we get bogged down in, that needs to be refined, that needs to be reformatted or re-understood, so that we can focus on loving God, loving neighbor, making disciples. If what we're doing isn't part of those three things, then we need to reevaluate it. Or if even if it is doing it, is there a better way to do it? Is there a way to change it up in a way that still feeds the people that are here but reaches other people more effectively? And there's not a one size fits all answer to that. This is a journey. This is something that we're going to go on from here forward. And it's always good to be constantly reevaluating it. We're not going to sit down here for a couple hours, make a couple decisions, do it that way, and then run for the next 60 years exactly the same way. That's not the point. What is the point is to really take a look at what it is that is essential, and how do we do it to the very best of our ability, knowing that that's what we are called to do as followers of Christ and as the church. So, a couple of years before I even entered into seminary, I was working as a volunteer at my home congregation. I was on council, and our pastor gave us this book, and it has one of the best names for a churchy book that I've ever seen. And it's called Sacred Cows Make Gourmet Burgers. Um, if you're familiar with the story of the sacred cow, Moses melting down the golden calf, it's about idolatry. It's about making something that isn't God into God. Um, and one of the things that the author, William Esom, gets at is one of the things that we idolize as churches is power and control. We want to have a handle on everything that happens. And we've made an idol of it. We have organizations that say this is the right way to do things. This is the only way to do things. And if you want to do something new, then you're out of luck unless you get it approved by me. Now, uh, I want to stop you right here because just because you have an idea doesn't mean that's automatically what's going to be done. But this visioning process is one of hearing all sorts of ideas and spreading out the responsibility for creating this mission and vision for this church. There's a lot of really cool stuff that's going to be happening, but what we have to do is get rid of this idol of control because sometimes we try to exert control even when we're not really supposed to. And when we look at Romans and how we can frame this argument and this discussion around what do we make idols out of? What is the one thing we're not willing to let go of? Um, it'll really help us if we understand that anything that we're not willing to let go of, unless it's the gospel itself, uh, is an idol. It's something we need to let go of. There's a lot of things in the church that we kind of get stuck on and say, it's not church unless we do this. It's not church unless we do that." There's a couple things that really do fall into those categories, but I'll be totally honest, most of the stuff that you're thinking of is not critical. Um, we'll get more into the details of that after these sessions. This is just, we're talking about what does God have to say about these things. We're not here to get into the nitty gritty of, you know, what songs are going to be sung and what does the children's program look like. That's not why we're here today. This is more of a getting us all on the same page as to why we're here, what it is we're trying to accomplish, and we can work on those details later. So, we're coming up here now to our next breakout session, and here are the prompts. It came up here on the screen. I hope it did for you like it did for me. So here's our next breakout session. I'll tell you the questions, and I'll break you all out, and you'll have about 15 minutes again to kind of talk amongst yourself. First question: what is exciting about trying new things for the church? Like, not the specific things you want to try, but like, what is it that gets you excited? Like, why is doing a new thing exciting for you? What is it that sparks that interest for you? The next question is a little bit more specific. Are there any new things you're looking to forward to being a part of? Or maybe that you want to suggest, hey, I think we should maybe do this. It's a great time to just throw out ideas. We're not here to discuss them in detail. This is not a space for you to say, hey, this is what I'm excited about and I want to try. And somebody say, well, no, that's wrong. And that's why you shouldn't be thinking about that because we're never going to do that. Or that'll never happen. No. What is it you're excited about? Just throw those out there. The last one is, what are you afraid you might lose as a part of these transitions and changes? What's something that you're afraid might get left behind to make room for something new? And again, this is not a space for us to debate and say, oh, well, you shouldn't be afraid to lose that. That doesn't make sense. Or, oh, we're never getting rid of that. So don't worry about it. This is just a space to be open and honest and say, this is what I'm excited about. And this is what I'm worried about. So again, I'll get you all broken out. You'll come back in about 15 minutes and we'll keep moving on. Welcome back, everybody. But I got to tell you, I don't want to welcome you back appropriately. And that's because I made a programming error. It's take a break time. So now that you've had that discussion time, I want to invite you to take another 10 minutes now that you're done discussing in your small groups. Take 10 minutes, grab a cup of coffee, grab something to drink, grab a snack, use the restroom, whatever it is you need to do, and I'll see you back here in 10 minutes. Well, welcome back, everybody. I hope you had a chance to grab something to drink. I grabbed myself a seltzer water, uh, lime and cherry, and like lemon. It's really good. I got it at Target, so if you have those, enjoy it. Um, Now that we're back, I actually want to do things a little bit differently. I changed the order while we were away, just because I thought it would make a little bit more sense to come back in and go to our small groups one more time. So here is our next breakout group discussion. And here it is. Here's kind of a thought-provoking question. And I want you to answer this however you feel called to. What is the first couple of things that come into your head when I ask the question, what is the point of our church? Why is it here? What is its purpose? What are we here to do? Um, I don't want you to assume much. I just want you to the first thing that starts coming into your head, and just be open and honest with your groups. I'm not gonna ask for much feedback on this one unless you have something really important that you feel like I need to say this. I just really want to start those wheels turning. So I'll give you a few. I'll give you just 10 minutes to filter through this and decide what it is. That you're going to say, what's the point of our church? So I'll see you back in about 10 minutes. I'm going to break you out right now. Well, thanks for taking the time to think about that. I know that that's not the easiest kind of thing to describe, but I hope it was a productive conversation nonetheless. Now we're going to start to look a little bit more closely at the church in Rome. That is kind of the basis and the framework for our study today. Kind of see what it is that we can learn about what's going on with them, and then hopefully see where that relates to us. So I'm going to get that rolling right now. Technical stuff. Here we go. Roman house churches and our church. One thing to realize is that every study of like the earliest churches, there's not a church building. There's not a single congregation of people gathered in Rome. It's several small groups, all kind of affiliated with each other, all a little bit different, meeting in people's houses. So one big congregational meeting or Zoom meeting, as it were, was probably pretty tough to do. So it's a pretty complicated time. So when you think churches, try not to think in terms of one big gathering. We're talking little small groups. And this particular uh, group of house churches and group of Christ followers, early Christians in the Church of Rome, had just been through some pretty tough stuff right around the time that Paul was writing this letter. Um, the Women's Bible commentary here kind of lays it out pretty straightforward, pretty short, because it's kind of a complicated story. The shortest version and the version they kind of describe here is that there was a disturbance in the Jewish community around somebody called Christus, or as we think is now Christ, around Jesus, and it caused the emperor Claudius. Yeah, Claudius, I got that right. Um, to kick all Jewish people out of Rome, kicked them just all straight out, and that included the Jewish people who were beginning to consider themselves followers of Christ. And all that left in the city were Christians that came from non-Jewish backgrounds, those Gentiles that were converted. So these were not people who grew up reading the Torah, going to synagogue, doing all that, and hearing these stories of God each and every week and living and breathing, the Jewish God and understanding things like Jesus as the line of David and the son of that God. All that was left were these Gentile Christians, these Gentile Christ followers, and they were kicked out of the city for several years until the emperor died. Then all Jewish people were going to be allowed back into the city, including these Christ followers, and it was actually the source of a lot of the tension that Paul tries to address. There's these Christ followers that are very immersed in the traditions of the Jewish people, that Israelite heritage, the nation, the chosen people, the appointed by God. You know, these people who have been waiting their whole lives for a Messiah. And as I'm sure you've heard or know, there's all sorts of dietary rules and association rules, who you can hang out with, who you can eat with, who you can be in business with as a Jewish person. And those rules don't apply to the Gentiles. And one of the things that Paul addresses in both this letter and other letters is that no, you don't have to become Jewish first in order to become a follower of Christ. Whole sections of the book of Romans. I'll put a list of some verses here on the screen that specifically talk about that, and you can write them down and check them out on your own time. Um, but it's just filled with no, you don't have to become Jewish in order to become a Christ follower. And for all of the men in the room, I'm sure that's something you are all very grateful for, because one of the requirements to become a Jewish convert as an adult is to still go through circumcision. So sorry for too much information, but you would definitely appreciate not having to become Jewish in the first place in that scenario. And most Gentiles at the time would be. So that was not a requirement, and I'm sure the Gentile Christians were very grateful that Paul came along and said, "No, no, 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 don't worry about that." Um, but they have these different cultural identities. They have these different ideas of how to talk about God and how to approach worship and how do we approach what we do and what we eat and what rules do we follow? Do we keep the Sabbath? Do we change it to Sunday? Do we have a special day or do we not have a special day? What can we eat? What can we drink? Where can we go? What kind of work can we do on Saturday? These were just cultural differences, and after the Jewish Christians were kicked out, the Gentile Christians kind of were in charge. They didn't have to deal with all of these issues because they'd all been kicked out of the city. And Paul is writing at a time where it's like, okay, the Jewish people are back and they're trying to have kind of this power struggle a little bit. I know we don't know anything of what power struggles are like in the church. Am I right? Okay, yeah, I'm kidding. These kinds of things happen. They're not new. That's the good news. And Paul lays out this kind of not argument, but this framework for saying like you guys are really focusing on the stuff that's not critical. What you need to realize is you're both a part of God's plan. You are both special. You're both unique. You don't have to become one another. You don't have to change one another. You guys can both exist and be faithful followers of Christ, even if you don't necessarily agree on exactly what looks like. And he lays out a lot of great arguments of for what it really looks like. Um, the book that I mentioned towards the beginning by Grebe that talks about what is the story being told, what is it, what is the point of the letter of Romans, and it was really to locate both of these groups into the greater story of God and God's people, God's creation, redemption, salvation, and it's more than just one group or the other. Paul never tries to tell one group that they're better. Never tries to say one group should take over the other group. It's just let each other be. Um, the Jewish Christians really wanted to stay as Jewish as they could be. And they really thought that because Jesus was a descendant of David, he was the Messiah, the King of the Jews, that if you were going to follow him, you should be Jewish. And Paul and the Gentile Christians just disagreed on that. They saw a bigger picture. They saw evidence pointing all the way back to Abraham in the Old Testament, back in Genesis, about this idea that God is faithful to all people who have faith. And you don't have to be Jewish, you don't have to go through the rituals that are associated with that. But not that those are wrong or that they should go away. And that's the beauty of the argument, is that there is no argument, or at least there shouldn't be. Um, it doesn't make sense to somebody on that side where they said, well, Jesus is a Jew and he came from a Jewish line and he followed all those rules. Shouldn't all his followers? It's not as though they were wrong. They just didn't have the whole story, and that's really what Paul was trying to get out and to show them. So, in addition to that great history lesson out of the Women's Bible Commentary, Beverly Gaventa is who wrote that particular section, commentary on Romans, for that larger work. I, of course, had to go grab one of my favorite texts on mission and evangelism, missional church, um, and and he really lays out this argument that the reason that Paul has any kind of authority to be writing the church in Rome, because Paul had never been to Rome at this point. Paul didn't know most of these people. He knew some of the story. He knew how the Jewish Christians had been kicked out. He knew how the Gentile Christians had kind of asserted their dominance a little bit. But there wasn't like a personal connection. Unlike the other letters of Paul, this wasn't a church that he started. These weren't people that he hung out with regularly. Um, so the thing to make note of, he addressed their their behavior, their structures, the things that they had put into place with an authority that you normally wouldn't think, because they don't know Paul that well. Paul doesn't know them that well, but Paul speaks with this kind of authority to this church because he assumes that they understand the good news of what God was doing through Jesus either way. And that's how he crafts this argument. It's like, listen, okay, we've got these cultural ideas, we've got these non-cultural ideas, we have these structures and formats that we just don't agree on. But what we can agree on is the good news, and this whole letter is structured around that. You are part of God's story, whether you are of Jewish descent, of Gentile descent, Jesus Christ, what he did for you and for all of creation is real. And you're a part of this bigger story. Paul doesn't need to have been in Rome to make this explanation for them. Um, he just assumes, like, listen, I've been sent as an apostle to the Gentiles, and I know what you're going through. I know this is tough, but trust me, you are all a part of this bigger, grander story, and I think that's a powerful message for us to hear as a church, especially as a church that's trying to figure out, what do we do next? Do we do things the way they were used to be done? Do we do things in a totally new way? Is it a little bit of this, a little bit of that? The truth is no matter where we fall on those spectrums, we are still beloved by God. We're still a part of God's story, what God is doing in the world, what God has done in the world, and what God's going to do next. So, no matter how we fall on that kind of cultural line, no matter how we understand the right way to do things, we're still a part of this greater story, this greater ambition, this greater narrative that God has crafted in this whole world, in all of creation, in all of the cosmos. And when we start to think along those lines, when we start to see that Christians in all times and all places have had their disagreements about exactly what church is supposed to look like, what mission is supposed to look like, what worship is supposed to look like and sound like, what the cultural stuff is supposed to be like associated with Christianity. When we start to see that those arguments have been had from the very beginning, just like the people of the church in Rome, we can better identify them. We can with them. We can better see our place just like them, not as one being better than the other, but just both being different, beautiful, equal partners in the gospel. And that's very good news. So that little presentation section went a little bit long. So I don't want us to take too long on this next breakout session, but let me get that information up here on the screen. And our next set of questions is this. We talked earlier about how exactly does our church uh, live out the mission statement that should be the mission statement of all churches: to love God, to love neighbor, and make disciples. What parts of this do you think that we struggle with the most? What's the one part that gosh, that one's a little tough for us as a group? But what part are we the best at? Which one of those do you think we're really good at? And there's not a right answer here. There's not a wrong answer, just like before. I just want to have you discuss it. I don't want you to debate it. I don't want one person to say, "Well, I think we're really good at this," and the other person comes along and says, "Well, no, 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 you're wrong. We're terrible about that." This is just how you see it, how you interpret it. And I think even more than the questions and how we answer them, but how we respond to one another, how we hear each other, how we start practicing this idea of, okay, so you see things differently, but we're both still partners in the gospel. I think that's going to matter even more. And so I'd ask you to keep all of that in mind, as well as Luther's explanation of the eighth commandment as you go ahead and discuss this in your breakout groups. I'm going to get you set up in those groups right now, and I will see you back in about 10 minutes this time. We're going to be this a little shorter. Well, welcome back, everybody. I hope your conversations were good ones. I hope you're able to keep in mind this spirit of the Church of Rome that Paul is describing, where we listen well and agree to exist in ways that affirms everybody is an equal partner in the gospel, that nobody's got this exactly right. If anybody's got this church thing down exactly 100% right, I want you to reach out to me and tell me how it's done because I think we all struggle. And as Paul writes often, especially in Romans, um, all fall short. We all make mistakes. We don't ever always get this right. So, good to keep that in mind. We're going to go to our next section here, and we're going to tie it back to something we asked earlier in a kind of thought provoking way. Um, and ask kind of the question like, what was the purpose of the early church, both in Rome and elsewhere in the New Testament? So let's get to that. So we don't get a ton of descriptions in the book of Romans about exactly what the church in Rome was like, exactly what to expect in their regular practices. Really, just the dialogues with Paul kind of writing under the assumption that he knows what's going on. We get a few more descriptions out of the church as it out of the early church as it's described, like in the book of Acts, for example. It's a church that's described as being very heavily influenced by the centrality of Jerusalem. That everything points back to Jerusalem, the original apostles, what people and the leaders were doing there. There's also descriptions of the early church, early Christians, early Christ followers, selling everything they had and pooling their money together to support each other, from the richest to the poorest, to those who were in the community that weren't associated with the Christ following movement. It's this kind of beautiful idea that like nobody's better than the other, everybody shares everything equally, um, and it's this a community, pure community. There's also examples in the books, in the letters of Paul to Corinth, the Corinthians. Those ones are a little bit more heavily tough to read, especially if you hear Paul's tone of voice. He's really laying into them sometimes, and the church in Galatia about what they're not getting so right. Um, but there's still this communal idea. You get a little bit more description in the books of Corinthians, especially First Corinthians, about exactly how to do things. There's also elements of like how to do communion, where that comes in, how to do baptism. You get a lot more of those kind of uh, concrete details about what people were doing regularly in their faith, out of those sections of the New Testament. And if you go back even further, what is the church like? What are Christians like? In the Gospel of John, there's this great passage. Uh, Just as I have loved you, love one another. By this, everyone will know that you are my disciples if you have love for one another. Jesus makes it really simple. It's about love. It's a lot less about how exactly you're supposed to do this or that, this ritual, that ritual, this kind of worship, that kind of worship. It's they'll know you're a disciple of me by your love. Love each other, and the rest will kind of work itself out. Is kind of my spin on it, my understanding of it. There's some early church writings, like a document called the Didache, which is hard to precisely date, but it was just a collection of, okay, so here's how baptisms work. Here's how you get ready for baptism. Here's how you get ready for communion. This is kind of the process by it. But we don't get a lot of that directly from Romans. Um, and it's interesting that Paul doesn't spend a ton of time on this is the right way to do it. This is exactly what you're supposed to do. And this is Paul's like latest letter that we can say 100% Paul wrote this. This is, the grand finale. This is the masterpiece of Paul. And Paul just doesn't get into that stuff here. And I think it's because at this point, in his career, he's writing about big picture stuff. The really, really important stuff. The stuff that really is foundational. And yeah, there's a couple throwaway lines here and there, and I don't mean throwaway as in you can throw them away. I mean as in they may not have grand cosmic significance, or maybe they were just more specifically for the church in Rome. I think specifically about some of the texts that are used to hurt people rather than harm people, especially questions around purity and sexuality and that kind of thing. Not all of that's necessarily um, the perfect use of Paul. It's definitely one that we have to be careful with and properly understand. That's for another time and place. We can get into that. Um, but Paul is really honing in on not what we do, but how we do community together, how we live together, how we celebrate each other in our differences, and not just allow it, but welcome it and say, okay, you're different than me. That's fine. There's nothing wrong with that. We can both still have faith in God, have faith in what Jesus Christ did with us, for us. Have faith that the Holy Spirit is with us each and every step of the way. We don't have to agree with that. And I think that might be the most powerful message of all in Romans is that this grander story of how we fit into what God is doing and then how we respond to one another and how we respond to the world, knowing that we're saved, knowing that we have a God that loves us. That's that's the critical thing. And as we look forward to what this continued vision process looks like, and as we discern what worship is going to look like when we're all done with quarantine and lockdown, and most people have been vaccinated, and it's safe to really gather in a real deep meaningful way again, we're going to have some disagreements about these things. It may not all look the same. It may not look the way it did before. It may not look much like what the church doing down the road is doing. But we can say with certainty that we can do these things in love if we make that intentional step, that intentional choice to love first and disagree second. And even in our disagreement, recognize the humanity and the beautiful goodness that is in the other person that disagrees with us. So if you're the kind of person who loves organ music and choirs and candles and all that stuff, or if you're the kind of person who prefers electric guitars, heavy drums, fog machines, and big stage lights, we can both recognize how beautiful the other person is, that they are created by God, that they have faith in the same Savior, that they are still saved by grace, just the same as the rest of us. And we can worry about the details later, recognizing that they're not the most important thing in the world, that the mission of God, to love neighbor, and to go make disciples is first and foremost what we should be worrying about. So, with that, I will get us ready for our next breakout session. I'm going to give you guys the full 15 minutes this time. And here is our prompt. And that prompt is, what parallels between the purposes of our church that we described earlier and the early church in Rome and elsewhere do you see? Do you see anything that where they line up? Um, is the Roman church a great model for how to church? Especially knowing that they don't give a lot of details? Ah, I see. I see. See, I hope you see where I'm going with this. So I want to give you 15 minutes to think about this. I will set you up into your breakout rooms right here in a minute, as always, and I will see you back in just a few. Well, hello again, and welcome back. I hope that that last little breakout group session was helpful for you. Um, I confess that I kind of hope that the conversation went a certain way. Um, the church in Rome doesn't give us a lot of specific details, except where it's confused and there's disagreement. And I think that to focus on how they uh, could and should handle those disagreements by Paul is a better model for how to church uh, from the church in Rome than necessarily their individual practices, exactly what they do to accomplish their mission. This next section is going to be a little tough. It's topic areas that we're not always so comfortable with, especially people who look like me. Um, Middle class white people in this country exist in a space of particular privilege, whether we understand it or not. And so we're going to be talking a little bit about church and church with those in the margins, those who dominant society tends to push away. Like I said, I recognize that these are not necessarily topics that are easy. We are not always going to disagree. I mean, just not always going to agree on the exact terms and terminologies and ideas around privilege. But I think these are important conversations to have and to at least be aware of in the church today. One of the things that the women's Bible commentary, I'm going to keep bringing this up over and over again, which may be ironic given that I do not consider myself a woman, um, is this idea that Dr. Gavenda once again puts up in her introduction to her commentary on Romans, especially, is this idea that created beings, people, all people, are loved by God, and if they're loved by God, then they need to be loved by us. And I can hear some of the thoughts that might be going through some of your heads because I promise I've had them too. Well, of course I love them. I love all people. All people are great. I love them very much. Um, I believe you. I hear you. But the important thing to remember is that love, especially in terms of God and of God's people, our love is shown by our actions. And so when we're talking about people who are different than us and also who are not a part of the dominant majority in our areas and spaces, um, we need to be thinking with special care and consideration for how we can love them in truly authentic and meaningful ways. Um, who do I mean specifically by people on the margins, marginalized peoples? These are Black people. These are indigenous people. These are people of color. These are LGBTQIA plus peoples. These are poor people. These are abandoned people. These are immigrants. These are refugees. These are all people who are deeply and intimately loved and cared for by God. And as a church and as a community of faith and as a group of Christ followers, we are called to love these people as God loves them. Just like Paul is trying to get out of these people in Rome. Doesn't matter if they come from a background different than you. You're gonna love them, and you're gonna treat them as though they're loved. Because if you love somebody, you treat them well. You treat them right. You welcome them in positive, affirming ways. You love them just the way they are, and you don't try to change them. So the question then becomes, well, what can we do about that? There are a lot of really concrete steps that congregations can take. Most of them are not in kind of the purview of what we're going to talk about today. There's the opportunity to become a reconciling in Christ congregation, to be openly welcoming and affirming of people. There's a lot of work being done as we speak by the Reverend Lenny Duncan, a former classmate of mine who wrote this wonderful book, Dear Church. Um, and the subtitle of that, if you haven't read it yet, is A Love Letter from a Black Preacher to the Whitest Denomination in the United States. Um, those are just plain facts, people. We're the whitest group in the world, in the country, I should say. And he lays out a lot of really great ideas on how to not only become welcoming spaces and places for our Black and person of color brothers and sisters in Christ, but also how to repair some of the damage that's been done. So this isn't so much about how to go really hard into those ultra deep, difficult questions and decisions that need to be made. Um, about joining organizations, sending money, those kind of things. Those are conversations that can be talked about, and I think we need to talk about them soon. It's not something we want to sleep on, but to keep it within the kind of framework and scope of today, the question becomes is how do we looking at what worship and mission and ministry is going to look like in the post coronavirus world, how can we make a place and a space that is not immediately, um, you know, has people put up their blinders like this doesn't make sense to me. Um, how do we try to tone down some of our pre-existing cultural and ethnic stuff so that it's not just what used to exist before and in ways that only make sense to certain people who look a certain way who are from certain places. The text in the evangelizing church, a Lutheran contribution. There is some irony in this because Lutherans tend to be not the greatest at evangelizing, but there's still some wonderful, wonderful material in this text. And there's this idea that we have a sense of ethnic idolatry in a lot of our churches, and I haven't been here long enough to know exactly what those are here, especially because we haven't been meeting in person. But a lot of churches in the United States have real ethnic undertones and overtones to both their worship and their gatherings and their fellowship. We make jokes about them. There's hot dish culture, and there's lutefisk, and then there's how we decorate our sanctuaries and what kinds of Christmas decorations go up. I've been to churches that are heavily influenced by Germanic tradition and Norwegian tradition and Swedish tradition. And now there's a lot of churches that are heavily influenced in their design and their feel and their fellowship by an ethnic tradition of white America in the 1950s and 60s. Um, and not that those none of those things are wrong. Hear me when I say none of those are bad things. But when we focus in on them so hard and we refuse to change them because that's the way it's done, that's what we like, that's what our group does, we can make an idol out of these things. And the text really speaks to this idolatry of these ethnic identities. You know, we are the Lutheran Church that is descended from Swedes, and we do Swedish things, and we do them in Swedish ways. And you don't have to be Swedish to come here, but you're gonna love what we love when it comes to our traditions, or Norwegian, or German, or Finnish, or whatever it is, or white Americans in the 1950s and 60s when Lutheranism was at its height. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. These are not bad things. These are not awful traditions. We should celebrate them. But when we make idols out of them, when we refuse to change them, we start acting a lot like some of the people in the churches of Rome, the house churches of Rome, that are just like, no, this is the right way to do church. This is the right cultural identifier. These are the rules that you have to follow and the foods you have to eat. I hope you see where I'm going with those. We're not telling you that those things are bad. They're great things, but they can't be the thing that describes best what you believe about God and how you celebrate each other. Um, I mean, how many of our traditions and activities have some kind of an ethnic identity about them? I'd argue most of them in some ways or another. And we have to really take care to make sure that we aren't focusing too hard on any one of them. Because we can also make an idol out of non-majority things and prop them up and tokenize them and say, see, we did this good thing that's associated with this other culture. So now it's okay that we do our stuff the other 99.5% of the time. Both of those can be dangerous and bad. We don't want to belittle anything and we don't want to prop up anything. These kinds of ethnic identities and identifiers and traditions are some of the things that the house churches in Rome got caught up in, and I think a great portion of Paul's letter is really set up to make us think long and hard, not about removing them or eliminating them, not about saying no, all of those things are wrong and gone. Those are former things. These cultural identities and markers, these things that we hold dear, our traditions, shouldn't be tossed aside. They should be celebrated, but we need to make sure that they are not the focus of our ministry and that the mission of God in this world, the mission of the church in this world, to love God, to love neighbor, and make disciples is our primary focus, and that we don't get caught up in idolizing um, what kind of decorations go on the tree, what kind of foods that get served at events, what kinds of songs and what national hero worship goes on in addition to the worship of our God. That we really need to make sure that we are keeping the mission of God first and foremost, and only celebrating those things when it is appropriate to, and to not make idols out of them. So we're on to our next to last, actually no, our last breakout section. So as before, I'm going to give you 15 minutes. And I want you to think about these ideas. How do we as a church be more intentionally welcoming? And with the understanding that welcoming isn't just saying, of course you can come here. Just act like us and think like us and dress like us and sing like us and worship like us and enjoy the things that we enjoy. How do we be intentionally welcoming, truly creating a welcoming space and environment in love for people that don't necessarily look like the people who have been here before? And then secondly, what active role do you think you can play? Where do you think you fit in this? And we're not all going to fit in the exact same way. And this is not a contest, and this is not, again, let's keep that explanation to the eighth commandment in mind. And let's really think in terms of loving one another as we discuss this. There are no wrong answers. And I want you to affirm and lift up all ideas at the table. So I'm going to put you into your breakout rooms, and I'll see you in about 15 minutes. And actually, after those 15 minutes, I want you to go ahead and take another 10-minute break because we're coming up on our last section, and I want to make sure everybody is fresh and ready for that. Welcome back one more time from your breakout group and from your last break. This is going to be the last official section. And to be mindful of your time and of mine, it's a busy day. Let's get right to it. So here it is, wrapping up and final thoughts. Uh, One thing that I like to point out is that even though I am a fairly non-traditional Lutheran and Lutheran pastor, I am still well versed in the classics. H. Richard Niebuhr's Christ and Culture is one of the just most pivotal books of theology and understanding of the church and Christ's role in the church and church's role in culture that's ever been written. And so I just wanted to make sure I threw out my official thoughts on this and as it pertains to what we're talking about today in the context of Romans and in the context of what mission and vision is going to look like as we enter into this potential new phase of our time together and of this congregation's life in this community and in the world. Um, there are several archetypes of churches. There's the church that is against culture. That the church is so different from its surrounding culture that it's almost recognizable. There's a clash that it's just it's so much different. We are intentionally different from the rest of the world, and it's just we're nothing like those people. The next one is the Christ that is of culture, that where the church looks so much like the outside world that there's nothing different about it. There's nothing unique about it. That God is so muted and hidden that it's almost indiscernible from just a regular country club. There's the Christ above culture. There's the church that sets itself apart, but not in a like we're so different, but in where we are just so much better than everybody else. Look at how good we are. Look how special we are. Oh, you poor things everywhere else. The final one, the Christ and the church that is the transformer of culture, where the church is in culture, but it doesn't let it be. It tries to transform its surrounding community in ways that is powerful and life giving and better reflecting of the kingdom of God and what God is trying to accomplish in the world, a more just and more equitable society. But when thinking about those different things, one, my hope is that every church becomes a transformer of culture, um, that we truly understand our surrounding culture and helps to be a part of the positive change in this world. Um, and that we shouldn't be too much of culture in a way. I'm a big fan of using media that looks and sounds like culture, but that is separate and distinct. But we do need to make sure that we don't let the outside culture influence us too much. We want to make sure that we are still recognizable as the church of God, no matter what we do, even if what we do doesn't always look like what the church used to look like. That doesn't mean that that's what it's supposed to look like. If Paul is telling us anything in his letter to Romans, it's not necessarily those the sights, sounds, and smells. It's about what our focus is. Um, we also can't let our own culture and tradition inside the church get in the way of our ability to make a difference in our communities. We can't make such positive and strong idols out of our culture and our traditions and our ethnic backgrounds and our history. We can't let those things take up so much time of our so much of our energy, so much of our resources, and so much of our hearts that our ability to participate in transforming culture is burnt out by the time we have a time by the time we get to it. We have to make the mission of God first. Our internal culture can be just as dangerous to the church and church's mission as the external culture can be to change us into something that we're not supposed to be. So that's the one bit of classics in a way that I try to bring into this is to not let our history and its culture unduly influence what it is we're trying to accomplish, to love God, to love neighbor, and make disciples. I think Paul is super helpful in that, in showing that those things can be great and celebrated, um, but we can love each other in our differences and make the good news our first and foremost priority. Last but certainly not least, While I was on internship about a year ago, I was studying with our congregation this book, The Invitational Christian. And like many of the books that I've referenced today that aren't heavy theology, this is primarily focused on how to evangelize as a Lutheran in the 21st century, how to be a Christian and encourage people to join us in our walk of faith. But there's a powerful message here that I think was unintentional by the author. Um, One of the whole sections is based on the idea that you don't just tell somebody what they should do. You not only invite them to come with you, but stay with them every step of the way. So as we look at our mission and vision going forward, this is going to be something that I'm going to use as a bit of a framework in that way, because empty invitations are no good. Um, and there's this really kind of powerful message that when you want somebody to really see what God is like, you invite them to come with you. One of my favorite pastors, he's a Southern Baptist preacher at a mega church in Southeast Florida, where I'm from. He said one of the most powerful invitation tools a Christian has is to give somebody the finger. And everybody laughs. But he says, it's not that one that you're thinking of, because that one will get you in trouble. I don't want to see anybody from church giving people that finger. It's this one. I want you to come with me. I don't want you to just come and I'll sit apart from you. I want you to come and be with me alongside me as we experience this church thing and this God thing together. I think one of the unintended consequences of this thought process is it leads me back to Paul and these groups of Christians in the church in Rome that don't agree on a lot of things. They struggle. They have different cultural identities. They live their lives in different ways. But they can still walk alongside each other on their journey of faith. They can both profess Jesus is Lord. That God who created us, loves us, saves us, sends the Spirit to empower us. We can walk alongside people with different cultural understandings of Christianity and what church is supposed to look like, what it's supposed to sound like, and what our gatherings are supposed to smell like and taste like when we get together for fun and food. That there's people who are going to be in our midst that we don't necessarily always understand. They do things a little differently. Maybe they're just a little bit weird, but that's a good thing because we have the opportunity and the privilege to walk alongside them, to journey with them, and to love them authentically and powerfully because we love them just like their own God, their own creator loves them and us. We are called to love one another just as Jesus loves us, just as the God who created us loves us. We're not called to bicker and argue about exactly what things are supposed to be like, but we are called to love each other in the process, even as we discern, even as we work out these things together, what they're supposed to be, what they're supposed to act like. And we're not always going to be happy. Decisions are going to be made where we disagree, even once the decision's been made. We can't make everybody happy, but we can make sure everybody's loved. And we can work each and every day to show that love so that we can love our God, love our neighbors, and go make disciples here in this community. And as we go forward, as we get ready for this next phase, this next season in our congregation's life, I invite you to love each other and love our world as we go forward and try to make that happen as best we can. With that, that ends our presentation. I'm going to go ahead and leave an open floor for questions. If you could just raise your hand before unmuting your microphone, as is good Zoom etiquette, and I'll call on you. And thankfully, with Zoom, all your names are on your little pictures. So even if I don't know your name 100% yet, it'll be right there for me. I look forward to your questions, and let's get to it. Who has questions?